Prom night. For most teenagers, it's supposed to be unforgettable, the kind of night you look back on years later with a smile. The tuxedos, the sparkling dresses, the nervous laughter, the music that makes you feel like the world finally belongs to you. For one young boy, it was exactly that. A night of dancing, a night of freedom, a night he thought would mark the beginning of adulthood. But what he didn't know was that when he returned home, his entire world would begin to rot from the inside out. Because waiting for him wasn't comfort, it wasn't family, it wasn't safety, it was betrayal. Not the kind of betrayal you recover from, not the kind of mistake you can forgive. This was the kind of betrayal that comes disguised in the face of someone you trust, someone you depend on, someone who should protect you. She wasn't a stranger in the dark. She wasn't some nameless monster. She was his stepmother. And on that night, while he still carried the glow of youth and celebration, she made a decision that would destroy everything he ever knew about love, about safety, about family. She gave him something far worse than pain, something far worse than heartbreak. She gave him a slow, crawling death, because what she passed on wasn't affection. It was a weapon that would eat him alive from the inside, little by little, until his innocence and his life itself were stripped away. Imagine this. You go to school, you dream of the future, you celebrate the biggest night of your teenage years, and then suddenly, you realize your own home is the battlefield, that the enemy isn't outside the walls. It's sitting across from you at dinner. That's the horror this boy faced. A prom night that should have ended in photographs and laughter instead became the beginning of a twisted story of family betrayal, disease, and ultimately, murder. By the time it was over, a woman who should have been a mother figure would be dead. A boy who once believed in trust and love would be broken beyond repair. And an entire community would be left asking, how could she do it? How could a stepmother, someone trusted with care, choose to infect her own stepson with HIV? And even more haunting, what drove him to the edge where betrayal finally turned to blood? This isn't just another crime story. This is a story that will make you question the people closest to you. It will make you wonder, can you really trust everyone in your family? Or are some relationships more dangerous than the strangers we fear in the night? Stay with me, because once you hear what happened after that prom night, you'll never think about family the same way again. But before we dive in, I want to know, where are you watching this story from? Drop your country or city in the comments, and if this is your first time on this channel, welcome. I share true crime stories like this, stories that will make you question trust, betrayal, and even the people you think you know best. If that's the kind of story that grips you, then hit that subscribe button right now and join us, because this is only the beginning. For 3 years, father and son had walked through grief together. When the boy's mother passed away unexpectedly, the world tilted off its axis. Nights became colder, mornings heavier. A household once full of warmth felt like a shell, echoing with silence. But grief has a way of binding people, or breaking them apart. In this case, father and son held on to each other. Through tears, through loneliness, through the aching silence at dinner, they formed a fragile kind of survival pact. The father, hard-working, quiet, the kind of man who carried pain in his chest without letting it spill. And his son, young and wide-eyed, forced to grow up too quickly but determined to be the anchor his father needed. Together, they survived. But grief doesn't last in isolation forever. At some point, people crave comfort, companionship, even love. And for the father, that came in the form of a new woman. She seemed warm at first, attentive, kind, the sort of presence that promised to stitch broken pieces back together. Her name was Margaret. She was older than the boy's mother had been, sharp-featured, her smile lingering a little too long. At first, the boy tried to accept her. He told himself his father deserved happiness again, but even from the beginning, something about her felt off. It wasn't anything he could point to, not at first, just small things, like the way she studied him when she thought no one was watching, her eyes calculating, as if she was weighing him against some invisible scale. Or the way she inserted herself into father-son traditions, slowly replacing the rituals they'd built in their grief with her own routines. And his father, blinded by gratitude and loneliness, didn't notice. To him, Margaret was salvation. To the boy, she was intrusion. Months passed, and Margaret's influence grew heavier. Her opinions became commands. She hovered over the boy's school life, critiquing his friends, questioning his habits. She grew controlling, almost possessive with the father, and soon tension thickened the air in the house. What had once been a fragile bond between father and son began to fray. Arguments surfaced, small ones at first, the father urging his son to be respectful, the boy insisting, "She's not Mom." Margaret fed on those cracks. Every disagreement between father and son seemed to widen her smile, though she masked it behind sighs and soft words. And yet, beneath the surface, she was hiding something much darker. She carried a secret inside her blood. A disease, something she knew about but never admitted. And instead of protecting the man who trusted her, instead of protecting the boy who had never asked for her presence, she made a choice that even now defies explanation. Was it anger? Was it resentment? Was she punishing the father by targeting the son? Or was it something even darker, something that had nothing to do with love or betrayal, but with a twisted sense of power? Because the truth is, she knew exactly what she was doing. At first it was subtle. She grew more affectionate with the boy than a stepmother should be. Compliments that lingered, touches that didn't feel right. She blurred boundaries that should have been sacred. And the boy, young, confused, still reeling from his mother's absence, didn't know how to react. He withdrew, but every time he did, Margaret seemed to tighten her grip. The father, meanwhile, remained blind. He saw only what he wanted to see, a woman who had filled the silence of his lonely house, a partner who had restored some form of normalcy. He didn't see the way his son stiffened under her touch, or the way her smiles never reached her eyes. But others noticed. Friends who visited began to sense something strange. One even whispered, "Your stepmom looks at you weird, man." But the boy brushed it off. What could he say? Who would believe him over her? And so, tension swelled in silence. By the time prom night rolled around, Margaret had already crossed invisible lines. The boy had already felt the unease of being watched, cornered, pressured in ways he couldn't understand. He left for that night desperate for escape, for a single evening where he could just be himself, free of her shadow. But what he didn't realize was that when he came home, everything would change. Margaret was waiting. And the decision she made that night wasn't just about him. It wasn't even just about herself. No, some say it was about the father, about breaking him in the cruelest way possible. If she couldn't control his heart, then she would destroy the one thing that mattered most to him, by taking his son. And that brings us here, to the question that still haunts everyone who hears this story. Was she mad at the dad? And did she decide to do the worst thing to him by hurting his son? The night of prom should have been a milestone. For Chris, it represented a rare moment of normalcy, a step into the kind of teenage rites of passage that had seemed so out of reach since his mother's death 3 years earlier. His father had been the steadying hand through those hard years, helping him with homework, listening late at night when grief came crashing in waves, and reminding him that life, despite its cruelty, still held joy if he looked for it. Prom night was one of those joys. Chris spent the day in a rush of nervous excitement. His father had insisted on taking him to get his tux fitted properly, and as they stood in the mirror together, the older man clapped him on the shoulder and said, "Your mum would have loved to see you like this. She'd be proud, son." That sentence stuck in Chris's mind like a soft echo all day. At home, the atmosphere was different. Margaret, his stepmother, moved through the house with a detached quietness. She had been part of their lives for just under 2 years, stepping into the fragile unit of father and son with an air of charm at first. But beneath that surface, cracks had begun to show. She had her own pain, her own secrets, and her own complicated feelings about being second in a house still shadowed by the memory of another woman. Chris tried to ignore it. He had more pressing things on his mind: his date, his friends, the music, and the glittering lights of a night that promised to make him feel, if only for a few hours, like a regular teenager again. The evening unfolded as it should have. Photos were taken in the front yard, his father smiling proudly behind the camera, Margaret lingering at the doorway, her eyes scanning Chris as though she were weighing something far heavier than a stepmother's watchful glance. At the prom venue, Chris laughed with his friends, danced until sweat dampened his collar, and for the first time in years, felt truly free. The night was electric. For a boy who had been forced to mature too fast, shouldering grief that wasn't his to carry, prom was more than a school dance. It was a chance to breathe. But while Chris revelled under the swirling lights of the gymnasium, Margaret sat at home in silence. The house seemed too quiet, the ticking of the clock too loud. She paced. She sat down. She stood up again. Shadows stretched long across the living room walls as night deepened, and somewhere inside her, a thought had already begun to crystallize. Margaret's relationship with Chris had been complicated from the beginning. He had never fully accepted her, though he tried to be polite. She, in turn, seemed to wrestle with resentment she could not name. He was a reminder of his mother, of the place Margaret could never fully take, no matter how many dinners she cooked or holidays she tried to make her own. And in her darker moments, she felt invisible in her own home, always second to the ghost of a woman who wasn't even alive. When midnight came and went, Margaret was still awake. She poured herself a drink. The ice clinked loudly in the glass, shattering the silence. Her thoughts spiraled. Her husband loved his son with a devotion she could never break into. That bond, unshakable, tender, born of shared grief, seemed to leave no room for her. By the time Chris's father had gone to bed, exhausted from waiting up, Margaret had already made up her mind about something she would later frame as an act of finality, an unthinkable decision that could never be undone. It was after 2 a.m. when Chris returned home, his jacket slung over one arm, his tie loosened, his head still buzzing with the echoes of music and laughter. He expected nothing more than a quiet walk to his room before collapsing into bed. Instead, he noticed Margaret waiting in the dimly lit living room. "Did you have a good time?" she asked, her voice low, almost gentle. Chris nodded awkwardly, sensing the strangeness in the air. "Yeah, it was good." She smiled, but there was something unsettling about it. A smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. The teenager shifted on his feet, unsure whether to continue the small talk or escape to his bedroom. He chose the latter, but before he could reach the hallway, Margaret's voice called him back. "Chris," she said softly, "we need to talk." What followed was not a conversation a boy should have had with his stepmother. Words that blurred boundaries, implications that confused him, and a suffocating pressure in the room that made his skin crawl. Chris tried to laugh it off, to excuse himself, but Margaret was insistent. She closed the distance between them, her tone shifting from soft to sharp, from vulnerable to commanding. In that moment, Chris felt the walls of the house, his supposed safe place, close in around him. This was not a misunderstanding. This was not a stepmother overstepping her role in some awkward, misplaced attempt at bonding. This was something else entirely. Something predatory. Something dangerous. The clock ticked past 3 a.m. as the night twisted into something Chris would carry with him for the rest of his life. Margaret, in the haze of whatever storm was raging in her mind, crossed a line no family should ever cross. She enacted a choice that was less about desire and more about destruction, a decision that seemed aimed at punishing not just Chris, but his father too. For Chris, the night that had begun with laughter, music, and the promise of teenage joy ended in confusion, violation, and horror. He was left staring at the ceiling in the aftermath, his chest tight, his mind unable to process what had just happened. The woman who had married his father, the woman who shared their table and holidays, had shattered every boundary of trust. And when morning light crept in through the blinds, Chris didn't know whether to scream, to run, or to bury the memory deep enough that it might somehow disappear. But Margaret wasn't finished. The act itself had not been the end. She had something else planned, something darker, something that would make sense only if her true aim had been to leave devastation in her wake. She had made the unthinkable decision, not only to destroy the boy's innocence, but to leave him with something that would echo long after she was gone. Chris couldn't have known it in that moment, but the consequences of prom night would haunt his body and soul for years to come. And for his father, who had once believed that grief was the greatest pain a man could endure, the truth of what Margaret had done would prove otherwise. Because what Margaret chose that night raised a chilling question that would echo through the community once the truth came out. Was she mad at the father and decided to do the worst thing possible to hurt him by hurting his son? The morning after prom night should have been filled with tired laughter, leftover glitter, and memories of music still echoing in teenage ears. But for Chris, the house felt heavy. He woke in his own bed, yet something in the air clung to him like a shadow. He remembered fragments from the night before, the way his stepmother's eyes followed him, the closeness of her breath, the decision that never should have been made. His chest tightened each time he replayed it. Downstairs, the silence was unnatural. His father, Mr. Dawson, was already at the kitchen table sipping black coffee, the morning newspaper unopened in front of him. Chris lingered at the doorway, expecting the usual small talk about prom. But his father didn't ask how the dance went. Instead, he studied his son with a gaze too sharp, too observant. "You look tired," his father finally said. Chris swallowed hard, nodded quickly, and muttered something about late nights and loud music, but he couldn't bring himself to sit at the table. He grabbed a slice of bread, avoided his father's eyes, and hurried upstairs again. That was the beginning. Over the next few days, a strange atmosphere settled over the Dawson household. It wasn't spoken, but it was felt, like walking into a room where an argument had just ended. Margaret, his stepmother, seemed different. She hummed while cleaning, moved slower than usual, and occasionally glanced at Chris in a way that made his skin crawl. She carried an air of quiet satisfaction, as though she knew something no one else did. Chris's father noticed too. He didn't voice it outright, but his stares at Margaret lingered longer, more suspicious. At night, the arguments began. Muffled whispers that escalated into sharp exchanges. Chris would lie awake in his bed, heart racing, listening to the two of them fight behind their closed bedroom door. He couldn't hear all the words, but the tone was unmistakable. Accusation, denial, fury. One evening, Chris accidentally caught Margaret in the hallway, standing in the dark. She wasn't doing anything, just standing there still as stone facing his bedroom door. When he flicked on the light, she smiled faintly and said she was checking the locks. But the look in her eyes told another story. Chris began avoiding her, sneaking out of the house, staying late at school, or finding excuses to hang around with friends. But even away from home, he couldn't escape the unease. Every time his phone buzzed, every time someone called his name, he flinched. He was unraveling under the weight of what had happened, and Margaret, she seemed to thrive on it. Mr. Dawson had always been a disciplined man, a provider, a father who expected order. But he was no fool. The change in his wife and son did not escape him. He noticed the way Chris avoided Margaret. He noticed the way Margaret avoided certain questions. Something was wrong in his house, and the silence only confirmed it. Late one night, he walked past Chris's room and heard muffled sobs. His son was crying into his pillow, trying to stifle the sound. Mr. Dawson froze in the hallway, fists clenched. His jaw tightened. He didn't knock, didn't enter, but the sound burned into his memory. The next morning, Margaret served breakfast with her usual forced cheer. Pancakes, syrup, fresh fruit. She placed a plate in front of Chris, who refused to touch it. The tension between them was thick, but she pretended not to notice, Mr. Dawson did. His patience was running thin. "Margaret," he said suddenly, his tone sharper than the knife on the table, "what's going on in this house?" The question cut the air like glass. For a second, Margaret froze. Then she chuckled softly, brushing her hair from her face. "Darling," she said sweetly, "you're imagining things." But her eyes flicked toward Chris, and that flicker didn't go unnoticed. The following week became unbearable. Chris's guilt gnawed at him like a parasite. He avoided his father's eyes, avoided Margaret's presence, avoided the mirror where his own reflection reminded him of that night. He couldn't shake the feeling that someone would find out, that the truth was crawling closer with every passing hour. And Margaret, she played her role too well. She smiled for neighbours, attended her church group, and kept the house spotless. But behind closed doors, she whispered things to Chris when no one else was around. Little comments, little reminders, meant only for him. "You don't want your father to know, do you?" she would murmur when passing him in the hall. "You and I, we share something no one else does." Chris would clench his fists, fight the urge to scream, but his voice would always die in his throat. At school, he stopped laughing with friends. Teachers noticed his distraction, his grades slipped. And still at home, the shadow of Margaret lingered over him like a curse. One stormy night, Chris's father came home earlier than usual. The house was dim, the rain pattering against the windows. As he walked in, he found Margaret sitting alone in the living room, staring at nothing. She didn't greet him. She didn't move. Upstairs, Chris's door was locked. Something snapped inside Mr. Dawson. He knew, though he couldn't yet name it, that his family was rotting from within. He confronted Margaret right there, his voice trembling with rage. "What did you do?" he demanded. Her lips curled into the faintest smile. She didn't answer. That was when Mr. Dawson realized, whatever had happened, it wasn't just a mistake. It was something deliberate, something unthinkable. From the outside, this was the kind of story people would expect to unfold in courtrooms. Arrests, charges, headlines, a scandalous trial that would end with Margaret behind bars, facing the weight of the law. Neighbours would whisper, detectives would testify, judges would condemn. That's what should have happened. But that's not how this story ended. Margaret was never arrested. She was never charged. She never even faced a courtroom. Something happened before the law could ever touch her. And that's where I'm going to stop for now. Because if you think the story ends here, you're mistaken. If you want part 2, I want you to comment below and let me know. Tell me you're ready for it, and I'll upload part 2 today. Trust me, you'll want to see what really happened, because the truth behind why she escaped justice will leave you speechless.